Um, Hello, friends and colleagues. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I wish I could attend this seminar because it addresses some of the very interesting and important issues. Though you're invisible to me, I want you to raise questions and make comments to this brief presentation, and you can send them to me through the organizers. I'm asked to speak at this session about inconsistencies. As I understand it, this topic explores the main outcomes of possible tensions between the national context and the international role of states. The organizers believe that given the widely known Chinese development model and its strong presence among developing countries, it would be interesting to reflect on the following questions. The first is, are human rights violations in China effectively recognized as a constraint to the country's international presence in the global South regions, such as Africa, with which China cooperates more substantially? I assume the answer is no. Human rights violations that occur inside China are not effectively recognized as a constraint to China's international trade and development presence. But I think this is a tricky question. The answer depends on whom you ask. For the governments and the officials in the global South, the political priority of attracting investment and trade may blindside them to human rights violations of the Chinese people inside China. How about the workers, the businessmen, the people in those countries where China does business and investment? Those folks may not necessarily know about what's happening inside China because of the information blockage. They may not realize that in China, the political elites wield unchecked power. There's little rule of law and human rights protection, especially labor rights. When state-run Chinese companies make investments in other countries, build dams, roads, or oil fields, they also bring them abusive labor practices and the tendency to suppress independent workers' union and workers' right to strike. Do you think it's possible for government to respect the rights of workers in a foreign country if that same government doesn't respect such rights for workers in their own country? Chinese officials and business executives would not have the awareness and the habits of the mind to do so because they have never had the experiences, training, or discipline for doing that back in their own country. And the same question would be answered very differently by the Chinese government and the Chinese civil society. Obviously, the Chinese government believes it would prevail, that is, in propagating the so-called Chinese development model, that is, to promote economic growth at the expense of human rights protection. To some extent, it will. That is, if the people's civil society in the global South are unable to speak up, get organized to resist or reject human rights violations that their own governments would tolerate in order to attract the Chinese government investment and economic aid. Then this development model that disregards human rights will be propagated in the developing countries and that have a big appetite for the cash and the infrastructure building that China can offer. How would this question be answered by the Chinese civil society? Human rights activists in China are very aware of the problems with the so-called Chinese model. They have suffered, and those whom they try to assist have suffered from its negative consequences, including polluted air, contaminated water, environmental degradation, food safety issues, labor abuses, violent demolition and forced eviction from land and private homes, and so on. Chinese human rights activists would caution the people in the global south against the notorious development model and support their efforts to reject their own government's decision to blindly introduce such a model. Because at the end of the day, it is the people who will suffer from the negative consequences. Make no mistake, there is really no inconsistency in China's behavior here, as I have been describing. The government behaves back in the home country, and it behaves in other countries in the same way. The Chinese government's economic development approaches that disregard human rights and suppresses democratization in China is simply being exported to the global south. This process involves transporting from China and planting the Chinese model on other soils, which is spreading both economic and ideological influence on developing countries, but unfortunately at the expense of universal values such as human rights, democracy, transparency, and rule of law, and so on. Now, the second question the organizers put to me is this: is it important to address the matter of inconsistency? Considering Chinese political engagement in the world, does it really matter for China to be consistent? In other words, does China's international engagement actually represent a political constraint for the country to behave? By inconsistency, I think we refer to another pattern of behaviors that involves the Chinese government's violation of human rights at home and its seemingly active engagement at the international human rights forums, such as the UN Human Rights Council, including China's efforts to appear as a force for promoting human rights. The inconsistency here has to do with building an international image and acting at home in the opposite to what that image is intended to project. Inconsistency here points to the Chinese government's refusal to bring human rights home, its failure to implement international human rights standards domestically, and shutting the door to human rights by labeling it as a Western ideology. As now, and there has been a war in the Communist Party-controlled press in China on universal values since the spring of this year. Why it matters that when it comes to China's international engagement, while the government makes promises on the world stage, but refuses to deliver on those promises to protect human rights at home? The answer to this question has to do with the fact that we operate under the constraints of some fundamental principles. If we take seriously the principle of universal human rights, if we want the UN, international human rights law and institutions to work, that is, if we want to make those institutions effective and to have credibility, we should mind this inconsistency, the contradiction, the discrepancy, the hypocrisy, as those exhibited in the pattern of behaviors by the Chinese government, or any government, but especially those governments that monopolize power, that is, authoritarian governments, dictatorships, who suppress dissent and wield unchecked power in their own countries, where their own people have no say and would risk their lives if they challenge their governments. Such an inconsistency also covers such behaviors as persecuting their own citizens who exercise their human rights and protect fellow citizens' human rights. If inconsistency, hypocrisy, breaking promises matter, the international human rights community should act accordingly by holding governments who behave in this way accountable to their own commitments and obligations. For China, these obligations are those required of all UN member states bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter, and those treaty obligations under the specific treaties that China has signed and ratified. By last year, China has become party to 7 of the 9 major human rights treaties, though it has only signed but not yet ratified the ICCPR. However, the government's violation of the human rights of its own people have not changed much in a fundamental and systematic way over the past few decades. So, there are many good reasons, as you can see, why the international community should hold the Chinese government accountable for its inconsistent pattern of behaviors. That is, its refusal to fulfill its obligations to protect the human rights of the Chinese people. One reason is this. It is quite simple. The international human rights regime should uphold its standards if it is to have any credibility. By this, I mean that there should be real consequences when any government fails to fulfill its commitment and obligations. As you probably know, on October 22nd, China is coming up for a review of its human rights record by UN member states under a mechanism known as Universal Periodic Review. And China is also seeking election this November to the Human Rights Council for membership for 2014 to 2016. In order to qualify its candidacy, China has made a voluntary pledge to the UN General Assembly to promote and protect the human rights and fundamental freedom of the Chinese people. But what is the Chinese government doing now back in China? It has been busy to try to systematically suppress efforts in the Chinese civil society where activists want to have their voices heard in these processes. That is inconsistency at its best. Thank you.